Steve and I were separated for 13 years after we grew up in a cult together. And then I was kicked out of my house at 17. And then we reconnected after 13 years. The cult imploded when the leader was committed to a psych facility.
If you have an original interpretation of scripture, the heresy bells start ringing. These pastors or cult leaders, they think they have this special anointing to find these hidden meanings.
When it's the Son of God telling you that they're the only truth, then they're right. That's a key differentiator, and there's only one.
Christianity is completely unique from all of the religion. Every other religion is you earning your salvation. You got skin in the game. That's rooted in the human ego to think that you can prove yourself before a perfect God to be able to earn that. Whereas Christianity, God came down and sacrificed himself for us. It just makes sense. And anytime you see a cult or any perversion of that, there's always an element of the human ego and always an element of either you can do this yourself and earn this, or you need something else other than Christ. Before we go, I have one more thing.
Look at these guys. Oh, I love it.
In this episode of the Defenders and Disciples podcast, I'm joined by twin brothers Stephen and Nathan Smith. Steve and Nate co-authored Men of God, Men of War. Their book covers Steve's lessons learned through the twisted faith of a religious cult, while Nate describes his lessons learned as a Marine in combat. If you want to pick up a copy of their book, then check the link in the description. I also had the privilege and honor of having Nate as my captain in the Marines. But for now, enjoy listening to Nate and Steve describe their motivations and experience writing the book, what constitutes a religious cult, the challenges of leadership, differentiating a Christ-centered church from a cult, what makes Christianity different from other religions, and several other topics. And then, at the end of the interview, I surprised Nate with a reunion of the Marines we used to serve with. And now I give you Steve and Nate Smith. Nate and Steve, welcome to the show. Thank you guys for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I am really excited about this discussion we're about to have, not least because obviously, Nate, you were my platoon commander when I was in the Marines, and also because of this awesome book we're going to talk about. So, just before we do that, though, to go over some of these icebreaker questions that I sent you guys ahead of time. And like I was talking about earlier, I've never had two guests on the show, so typically it's just one person who picks out of those. And since you guys picked different ones, I'm just going to go through them. And if one of you who didn't pick that one wants to answer, then Roger up and we'll do it.
Sounds good.
All right.
All right. So the first one is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Nate, you want to take that?
I do.
First.
Yeah, I think I tell my younger self to stop trying to be perfect. I think perfection is the enemy of progress in many ways, and it leads to a life that's based on fear. Fear of failure, fear of disappointing others, fear of not living up to a certain standard. And don't get me wrong, I think high standards are incredibly important, and all the people I know who have built a successful life have very high standards, but that's different than having this inflexible requirement for perfection of yourself and others. And I think it leads to, a less meaningful and fulfilling life. And it certainly can lead to not being kind to yourself and to others with all the deleterious sort of downstream effects of that. So it's taken me many years to just break out of the need for perfection, which is really a need for control, right? Which is fear-based, and try to lead a life that's more based on hope and love and kindness, but without sacrificing those high standards.
That's a good answer. I like that. Steve, what do you got?
Mine's similar. I mean, I would tell my younger self that the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is fear. So, if you're living a fear-based life, it's not from God. And maybe related to that, I would tell myself not to be an NPC. Have you heard that term? An NPC?
Yeah.
A non-player character in like gaming. So it's one that's controlled by the game. It's one that's pre-programmed to act a certain way, within highly defined limits. And I feel like that was so much of my upbringing was kind of this narrow focus of I can't step outside of the expectations for me. I can't step out of the role that's been defined for me.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would tell myself not to be an NPC, be a main player.
Man, I love both of those answers, and we could probably spend the rest of 2 hours on that. But let's go to the next one. So, Nate, you picked this one. What does your everyday carry consist of?
Yeah, I'd love to say it's a handgun, but it's not. I work in a business environment, and I found out a
Yeah.
long time ago that a leg holster, uh, it just wasn't comfortable and it wasn't practical. And I have a tucked in shirt always. So there you go. So instead,
Yeah.
I carry a James brand knife, and it's got a low drop clip on it. So most people think I'm carrying a pen. But
Yeah.
over the 5 years I've been at my company, whenever we have an event and someone needs something opened, they always know it's going to be me. They always reference it as a Marine, but really I think it's just that why go about your day without a knife? I don't know. It seems impractical.
Absolutely. Yeah. Steve, you didn't pick that one, but do you want to jump in?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a military guy,
axe.
so
Yeah, an axe.
yeah.
That's
I mean,
right.
I've always got an axe. I've got obviously axes in my shop, but I've got a vintage Collins felling axe in kind of under the seat well of my F-150, along with the goose wing broad axe. So it's there in the truck,
That's so
whatever may
cool.
happen.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that a little bit later because some people are like, why did he mention an
Right.
axe?
Why is he carrying axes?
Steve, you picked this one. 3 things you'd want to have on you during a zombie apocalypse.
Yeah.
And actually, let's combine that one and the other one because Nate, you picked this one. Name one person you would want to have on your team during a zombie apocalypse. Present party and immediate family excluded, because everyone obviously be like, "Oh, my wife or my kids or something." So yeah,
Right.
let's roll those two together.
All right, I'll go first. So I would definitely have a vintage Kelly felling axe. I
Okay.
mean, you can make shelter, you can defend yourself,
Mm-hmm.
close quarters. Almost any carpentry activity you would need to do in a situation like that, you could do with a felling axe. I've also got a Remington 700,
Mm-hmm.
for hunting and for standoff, security, and then some sort of integrated fire starter and fishing line. I think with those
Mm-hmm.
those 3 items, you're going to be in pretty good shape. And in terms of the people I know, immediate company and family excluded. I mean, Brian Stan, man, I would like
Yeah.
him on my team. He's just a clear thinker. He's a good leader. He's been through a lot of different, combat and life stuff. And if he was in my corner, I'd be all set.
It's a good pick. That's a good
Yeah.
pick.
So
Nate, what do you
that's
got?
funny. Brian Stan is also my pick, but since he's already been picked, if we're doing like kickball or whatever, I got to say I go to someone else. But I'd say Joe Clemmy, and he's not widely known like Brian is. He didn't fight in UFC, but Joe Clemmy, in my mind, was one of the preeminent platoon commanders that I am aware of in the Iraq War, and largely under the radar. But Joe, hailing from Worcester, Massachusetts, sort of grew up. I mean, I don't want to disparage his background. He had some criminality probably going on there in the background. Was an enlisted Marine. Commissioned. Was in my infantry officer course, and then we served together in Iraq. And Joe is just one of those guys who always knew what the insurgents were thinking. Always
Wow.
thought on his feet. Quick decision maker. When the chips are down, you wanted Joe there because whatever was going to come out of his mouth was right, the right thing to do. And that's just a
Yeah.
very uncommon, even in the Marine Corps, right, where you train to that standard. Not most of us can't live up to it, but Joe always did. He went on to do a career in Marine Special Operations. So Joe's
Okay.
great guy, family man, but gosh, he was the real deal.
That's awesome. You want to pick 3 things?
Yeah, well, It's widely known that if you don't drink, you die. So I'd have some like iodine tabs
There you
for water,
there you
assuming
go.
that the water
That's a good
system's down.
one.
And in terms of food and fire, I think Steve's point of a flint or something like that you could use
Mhm.
to create some fire. And certainly, I'd love to have either M9 Beretta or Colt M4. Both systems that I used in the war, very comfortable with,
Mhm.
lightweight ammunition. I mean, we can argue about stopping power and that sort of thing, but at the end of the day, I certainly, when it goes to Lord of the Flies, I don't want to be the one walking around with a stick. I
Mhm.
want a boomstick.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Again, fantastic answers. So, Nate, you picked this one. If you could have dinner with one person, dead or alive, who would it be?
I'm not going to say Jesus. I feel like that's always the right answer, so I'm not going to say that. Figure
The Sunday school
I'll have
answer.
dinner with him at some point in the future,
Yeah.
most likely. Winston Churchill or Teddy
Mm,
Roosevelt. To me,
okay.
both great statesmen, both somewhat reputed to be the smartest men of their day. Which when you think about statesmen and you think about today, usually you wouldn't even use the term statesman anymore. You'd use politician. Um, there's some great politicians, by the way, but
Hmm.
I think Winston Churchill is possibly the reason why we're not all speaking German
Mm,
today. When you think about when he was brought in to effectively save Great Britain, he basically saved Western civilization in many ways at the darkest hour there. Um, and won the Nobel Prize for writing, for literature. So his memoirs are considered some of the greatest literature ever produced, and that's because he was such
yeah.
a clear thinker, an effective communicator. He was personally courageous. He had his peccadillos, as any genius does. But Winston Churchill, I think, would be fascinating. And then Teddy Roosevelt. So I'm cheating here because you asked for one, but I'm going to give you two. Teddy
That's
Roosevelt,
all
I
right.
think, is one of the greatest presidents we've ever had uh, in terms of personality, in terms of pulling
Mm,
himself up by his bootstraps. Was the real deal. Lived on the frontier, and also was extremely well educated. He was a little bit xenophobic, but we can forgive that as someone who grew up in the 1800s, and
sure, yeah.
also established the national park system, and is in many ways is the reason that we have beautiful places that have been preserved. And I just like the fact that he was a guy, man of action, but also an educated man.
I like that. Steve, you want to pick? If you're interested in new innovative training tools, then you have to check out Ace VR. And make sure to use promo code DEFENDERS to get 1 month free. I'll admit that when I first heard about this device, I thought it was probably a gimmick and there was no way it would feel realistic. But the moment I put on the headset and held the controller, it was obvious to me that we had stepped into a new era of firearms training. Not only does the virtual reality environment accurately represent the real world, but the pistol controller has the same weight and feel of a real gun. And the trigger feels just like an actual trigger. With Ace VR, you can play several different game modes, from drills that work on the fundamentals of marksmanship to competitive stages, and even more entertaining modes that work on situational awareness. You can also compete with friends and others in the Ace community. And don't forget to use promo code DEFENDERS to get 1 month free.
Sure. Completely unprepared for this, but I think
Jesus.
Martin Luther.
Jesus.
I mean, we all right, but avoiding that answer to that one, I would say Martin Luther back in the 1500s,
Oh,
because
yeah.
Luther was a man who, so he was dealing obviously with a corrupt church, and
Hmm.
how to handle that. He wanted to be an internal reformer, and when that became impossible, he became an external reformer. But he was also dealing with a lot of socioeconomic stuff. Um, he was a musician. He was a writer. He was a man who loved food and drink and good company. And I think picking his brain and just he was not a perfect man. I mean, anybody we're going to pick, there's a list of things that you can point
Absolutely.
at and say, oh, what about? But I think he'd be a fascinating dinner companion, just to see what was going through his head and the journey he went on. And he was at risk of his life for a good chunk
Hmm.
of his life. And yet he still managed to rise above that and start the Reformation.
Yeah, he had some serious intestinal fortitude. Is there a particular book about him that you like? Because there's
Yeah,
so many.
yeah. Here I Stand by Roland Bainton is
Okay.
probably it is the preeminent Luther biography, and it's probably the best written as well.
Mm. What is again, phenomenal answers, and I love all those picks. What's the most unusual or interesting job? And I think Nate. Let's see.
I picked
Oh,
this
you
one.
both picked this.
Oh,
Yeah. What is the most unusual or interesting job you've ever had?
mhm. Nate.
Yeah, I mean, I worked at a doll warehouse for a summer,
Okay.
and everything you would think about how that went down and what it was like is true. It was
Magic Attic Club.
it was the Magic Attic Club. Don't know if
The
it's still
Magic Attic
around.
Club. We worked there one summer.
Would deny it actually if I knew that it was still around. But that was but what was interesting about that besides that it was a doll warehouse? I mean, at the end of the day, it's a warehouse and you're just kicking boxes and unloading
Yeah.
trucks, and it doesn't really matter per se what the product is. But one of my primary recollections of working there was the fact that it was a summer job and basically they were oversubscribed for high school kids that wanted to work there. And so there was, I don't know, within the first couple of days, they just culled the kids, and like 2/3 of the kids were told to go home. And
So there was a dock workers strike on the West Coast, and
that was
so
it.
the
Oh wow.
product wasn't coming in, and so then they had to cut.
Wow.
So I didn't know that context, but the point was that there were kids who were just going through the motions and they didn't make the cut, right? And so for them, it was just sort of a summer job, but that's
Hmm.
income that they lost, and
Yeah.
yeah, who knows what they did for the rest of the summer? I'm sure they're doing fantastic in life. This is not to sort of draw long term conclusions, but like the idea of showing up and doing your best no matter what. I think
Hmm.
you never know when life is going to have a vote, and it's do I get
Hmm.
the thumbs up or the thumbs down. So that was one of the lessons I took
Yeah.
away from it is sort of miserable job, not something inherently that you could be proud of. But at the end of the day, if you're showing up and doing the work, uh,
Hmm.
the for the people who are paying you, usually makes a difference.
Yeah. That's so true. I think it was Jordan Peterson talked about that. He mentions like dishwashing as an example. He's like, if you're going to be a dishwasher, be the best freaking dishwasher they've ever seen
Yeah.
and see where it takes you.
Well, it's like this.
Hmm.
It's like this motif from Atlas Shrugged, right? Which is a famous 20th century, mid 20th century
Hmm.
novel by Ayn Rand, who really
Hmm.
escaped communism, and then this was her
Hmm.
reaction against what she both had experienced in communism and what she observed in a fairly decadent America. But it was this idea of if you're making a hamburger, make it the best one anyone's ever had. And
Yeah.
while I'm not necessarily a subscriber of her philosophy in many ways,
Hmm.
her view towards life, that was a very powerful, I think, takeaway from
Hmm.
that novel is just whatever you're doing. And the Bible says this too, right? Whatever you're doing, do as unto the
Hmm.
Lord.
Yeah.
Be the best at it.
That's very good. I like that. Steve, what do you got?
I mean, I worked at that same job, and the guy who drove the forklift was cooking meth, in his apartment at home or in his basement at home. It was an exposure that Nate and I had never had before to a segment of society, um, that's there and that we had just never encountered. That was an interesting summer.
Yeah, I was going to say,
But probably
I
my
missed you after they told you to leave.
Well played, sir. Well played. Yeah, that was the job that we were moving pallets outside, and you got into a bee's nest, and there was all these little random things that happened that summer.
Oh my gosh.
I worked at a steel company one summer. This was another summer job. This was in college, and I was just cleaning steel all summer because they'd had truckloads of steel pipe that had gotten wet, so it all rusted, and it was cheaper for them to hire day labor to literally pour oil on these 40-foot pipes and take an industrial Brillo pad and just scrub off the rust. You know, it was cheaper for them to
Wow.
hire day labor than to get a whole new shipment of steel in. So that's what they did. So I worked for a summer with really fascinating people, and this one guy that I worked with, he was a conspiracy theorist, kind of a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, and his name was Jim, um, and he always brought this black briefcase with him everywhere he went, and it was thick, it was just full of stuff. And I asked him, I was like, Jim, what's in the briefcase? And he said there's hundreds of files, and every day after work he would go to the Portland Public Library and research all of the the homicides and the assassinations in the last century. And he basically was drawing that map that we all see in the movies of, like, this
Oh
going
my
to this
gosh.
picture, and then this goes up here, and it's all connected, and he thought it was all a CIA operation to kill Martin Luther King Jr. and JFK, and then local homicides too. He thought the government was involved through, like, psychokinesis, like they're making people do stuff like psychotropic warfare or whatever. So
Gosh.
and I was like, and he's lighting up his oh, what are they? They're like the Mustang menthol cigarettes or whatever. So he's
Uh-huh.
smoking the whole time, and I'm like, well, Jim, if the CIA can, like, hear our conversation, how are you safe? And he takes a puff. He's like, menthol keeps me safe. I was like, well, okay. So that was an
All
interesting
right.
summer job.
Exactly the person you want handling heavy steel.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So you guys just cleaned off all the rust with just like steel, like uh, steel wool, or
So it was basically these Brillo pads. It was like it wasn't steel, but
gosh.
we would just dump oil on these pipes and just rub the rust off all summer. So you've got these really accentuated, deltoid muscles, and by the end of the
Wow.
summer, it's like
Yeah. Wax on, wax off all
that's
summer.
it, all summer long.
Good gosh. And
Yeah.
I'm sure none of that was carcinogenic either, probably. And none of those chemicals are.
Yeah, right. There was no protection, and then the cranes would go over with the steel, and I'd kind of look up at it, and the foreman came by, and I was like, should I be wearing a hard hat? And he's like, son, if one of those steel pipes falls, a hard hat's not going to save you. I was like, okay.
Oh, that's so funny.
OSHA.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that reminds me of like when we used to, Nate, you probably remember this, we'd clean like rifles after a range day or something. And we'd have those solvent tanks, and Marines would never use gloves. They had the gloves right there, but no one
Oh, yeah.
ever used them. We're dipping our hands. And I'm thinking back, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was so bad.
Yeah. By definition, this is a solvent to bust rust and
Yeah.
carbon from metal. It would make a lot of sense to just put human flesh into it repeatedly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's human body mostly made of carbon. So the next one is, let's see. What is your favorite book and or movie? However you want to go with that.
Go ahead, Steve.
Nate. Okay.
You're more well read than me.
No. I've got lots of favorites, but it's funny. There's a little book called Watership Down that I think it's by Richard Allen. And man, it's such a phenomenal story told from the perspective of rabbits. And it sounds like a silly little story, but the way that it's told, it has all the emotional connection and pathos of human beings, and um it's still one of my, I can still read it, cover to cover. I've probably read it half a dozen times, and every time it gets me.
Wow. Can you share the premise?
Yep, it's basically these rabbits, there's a danger that's approaching this warren of rabbits, and this one rabbit has this sixth sense about it and tries to convince the leadership, hey, we got to leave the warren, and the leadership won't listen. So he escapes along with several other rabbits. Each of them have their own personalities, and they make a kind of an odyssey to find a new warren. And in that process, they encounter other vicious, creatures and other warrens that have their own issues. I won't give anything away, but it's basically a commentary on different societies, and how these rabbits are able to adapt and overcome. And it's kind of hard to summarize, but Nate, how would you summarize it?
Yeah, I think well, it's anthropomorphic, of course, where you get animals representing humans and human society, much like Animal Farm, or even Winnie the Pooh, right? Which is in many ways just represents different type or facets of personality. And because you've taken the human element out of it in terms of the distractions of people and the society that we're used to, it becomes universal in many ways. And it's, as Steve said, it's very Homeric in terms of the the journey that they go on, and then there's, as you would expect at the end, some redemption. But there's dealing with authoritarianism. There's dealing with the vagaries of predators and so forth. But all of it, any person reading it is going to associate all of that with society, and it's a very uplifting novel. You would just never expect to be fascinated by a bunch of rabbits, but
Yeah.
like Steve, I've probably read it a half dozen times over the years, and started, gosh, probably third or fourth grade was the first time I cracked it. And I read it a couple of years ago. It's on my shelf in my office at work. Actually, it's just one of these sort of universal tomes that I think everyone can walk away from scratching their head and saying, "Yeah, well, that makes sense. That taught me something about life and people, and
Yeah.
rings true to my observations of culture and society." Yeah.
I'm sure it's interesting too, because I mean, a rabbit is not particularly known for being able to defend itself. It's very vulnerable to many, many things. It has a lot of predators.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right.
Interesting. So, on that, what do you think is an overrated movie or book? We can get book as well.
Hurt Locker.
Okay.
I thought so. Hurt Locker, I walked out of.
Wow.
And it wasn't because of post traumatic stress, although I definitely had post traumatic stress at the time that I saw it. But I think what bothered me most about it was they had every opportunity to be accurate. And and I say that because I will tell people, if you want to know what it was like in Iraq, watch Hurt Locker. Like, in terms of the atmospherics and some of the things they represented, but then they folded into it all this garbage about, like, an Army EOD team linking up with a British SAS team in the desert. And I mean, just the friction, between the team members. And I mean, not to say that some of that stuff probably didn't happen overseas, but what I found unfortunate was that this became the movie that, whatever awards it won, right? Maybe Best Picture for the year. And it disappointed me that this is what your average American, or even, people around the world, were associating with people who were in Iraq, right? And so it's like, gosh, I wish you just kept that theme of accuracy and integrity. There's lots to show and talk about of what actually happened, without going off into these rabbit holes of, oh, now we're going to have this random EOD team in the desert with some SAS guys, and they're going to shoot these insurgents long range. We're going to make that into a whole digression. It's like, well, why? What? How does that advance the plot? So there's lots of movies that are garbage, but I'm not disappointed by them, because you walk in sort of expecting to be highly entertained. This is not realistic. But when you're sort of setting yourself up there to win a Best Picture award, I think that carries a lot of responsibility to just be faithful to the environment. And as I've said, there's lots to talk about EOD in Iraq, and there's lots of real stories that they could have related, and they just folded some foolishness into it. So that's why I think it was overrated.
Yeah, I've told people, like, from the military and law enforcement, and then also, oddly enough, like my engineering schooling, like, has ruined so many movies for me. Like, just understanding, physics, and then understanding, how certain things happen. It's just like I don't even like watching those types of movies anymore. Honestly, my favorite movie is The Greatest Showman, and like I like those types of movies because it's not like they're trying to make up something that they don't, they got horrible consultation on. And so I'm just, I'll watch them ever so often, but unless it's one that's where you are, like you said, you're going to just suspend reality, like a Marvel movie or something like that. It's fine, whatever. But there's just so many that,
or it's like American Sniper, right? It's like American Sniper, which I thought was a good movie about Chris Kyle. And I thought they generally did a good job about trying to be faithful to tactics, techniques, procedures, the way that people engage with each other. But then you've got this Navy SEAL sniper overwatching Marines, I think in Ramadi, right? So they're hot, they're sweaty, they're multi-day, multi-week operations, and their uniforms look like they came straight from cash sales, right? It's like, gosh, could you have just had these extras roll in the dirt? Or do something. Like, everything else was so well done. Like, couldn't you just, where were the wardrobe people or like the military advisors on that one? Like, just they can go get hot, sweaty, and dirty so that all of us can see uniforms that are not crisp and clean. And it's little details like that. And that was, in my view, a really good movie. So that's sort of an elitist critique, but still, it's like, if you're going to put tens of millions of dollars into production, that's a basic thing that you could get right to make it that much more authentic.
Yeah, these studios could just start going to SIF and buying all the returned gear.
That's right.
And then like, here, it's all broken, but eBay. That's what it's like.
Yeah, that's right.
Steve, what do you got for an overrated movie? You didn't pick this one, but I don't know if you want to answer it.
Oh, yeah. Both of the recent Willy Wonka movies were disappointing to me. I feel like there's so much that you could do with that, that subject. And I watched them with my boys, and man, I just didn't like either of them.
Yeah.
The one with Johnny Depp was disturbing. I was like, it's supposed to be a kids movie. Like, we don't have to take this dark, the way it's. And then the more recent one about Willy Wonka's background, I just thought the script writing was poor, and the cast wasn't great. For a book, I think Ulysses, in my mind, is the most overrated book, even though it's rated the best novel of the 20th century. I've tried to get into that multiple times. I'm a big fan of James Joyce. I've read a number of his other works and love them. And I cannot crack Ulysses. And in my mind, the best book of the 20th century should be one that speaks universally, not as so esoteric that only a handful of scholars understand it. To me, that's a failure of communication.
That's good. I like that.
Well, it's a luxury thing, right? It's virtue signaling from the intellectual elite to say, we're going to set this on a pedestal because only a few of us can understand it. Whereas like a Moby Dick, rightly occupies part of the panoply of, greatest American novels, which, there's a lot going on there, but anyone can read Moby Dick and walk away inherently understanding sort of the story. And they may not get all of the allusions and analogies if they haven't, in particular read the Bible, but that's not really a difficult novel. And there's lots of that today with elites sort of putting something out there that's unattainable for most, and it becomes, a Louis Vuitton handbag, right? It distinguishes me from the rest of you. You should aspire to this, but I'm happy to walk along carrying it. By the way, I know lots of people with Louis Vuitton handbags, so that was probably a bad example, but lots of good people own that stuff. But you get my point.
Yeah. I like that. Well, on the topic of I will say, well, it's not really rated yet, but on topic of amazing books, and especially ones that are accessible and very deep, this one is phenomenal. And I want to talk about this next. I don't know if you guys want to talk about um, maybe each share some brief vignettes about like what led to your motivation to write the book, however you want to go with that. I have some specific things highlighted in here that maybe I'll think of as you guys talk, but I just think maybe it would be instructive for you guys to go through your experience and motivations that led to that, and then I have some other questions that I shared that in relation to that.
Sure.
These devices reset your trigger after each shot so that you can dry fire just like you live fire in semi-auto. Plus, the Blackbeard fires a laser out of the bore so that you can track your shots and work on height over bore offset for close engagements. And the Blackbeard X uses an accelerometer to track and analyze the motion of your gun on their Mantis X app. Even the United States Marine Corps saw the training value in the Blackbeard X and began to utilize these devices in basic training. So now Marine Corps marksmanship coaches can analyze recruit shooting performance using the Blackbeard in order to make them better shooters. So stop wasting time with traditional dry fire, order yourself a Blackbeard or Blackbeard X today, and start training to a higher standard.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, Tara, thanks again for having us on here. It's great to see you. I know we haven't seen each other, I guess, for 14 plus years since we served together in the Marines, and have such fond memories of that time and those guys, and particularly of you. So glad to see that you're doing so well and you're running this great program and your business as well. In terms of the book, I think Steve and I never really intended to write this book. What we did intend to do, and I think what we did separately, was process trauma and events via writing. And that was, in my case, journals that I scribbled in a platoon commander's notebook in Iraq. After things happened, particularly during my second tour in Iraq, it was a very dark period. And then I spent a number of years in Washington State, where I served with you, Taylor, and that was also a dark time for me. And felt alone, isolated, and it's not that I didn't have friends or good people around me, but that's how I felt. And really, what that was me wrestling with post-traumatic stress and trying to assimilate back into American society in a country that really wasn't at war, or it didn't feel like it was. And so writing helped me just process through things that I wouldn't have talked to anybody about. I certainly wasn't going to see a therapist. And then, Steve and I, it's in the book, but Steve and I were separated for 13 years after we grew up in a cult together. And then I was kicked out of my house at 17. We parted ways, effectively had no contact with each other. I went the Marine route. Steve stayed in the cult, went the religious route. And then we reconnected after 13 years, basically at the time that I left the Marines. And at the time, the cult imploded when the leader was committed to a psych facility. So at that time, the writings that I think both of us had been doing independently and for ourselves, both of us turned those into blogs. I think, and I'll speak for myself, with this idea of, if this is helping me, maybe it'll help other people, specifically warriors, right? People who had served in the war. And I think it did, more or less. And so I got some positive feedback from folks, Marines I'd served with, and others, about some of the things I'd written. And Steve was doing the same thing as it related to people who had been in cults. And both of these environments, combat and cults, can be very traumatic, depending on your individual experience. And so I think both of us felt like we were helping others at the same time we were helping ourselves. But because we were posting these as blogs, also friends and family started seeing these as well. I think that helped them better understand us. And eventually those friends and family prevailed upon us to start working on a book and said, this is a story that should be told more formally. And so we did. We started working on it. And I think it's fair to say we probably spent the better part of 14 years taking these different vignettes, working through it, trying to achieve something coherent, comprehensive, but not too detailed. And then the last few years has really just been trying to get it to market, to find an agent, find a publisher, and have it live out in the world. And so that, to me, is the story of how the book came about and the motivation for writing it. It was never really to talk about ourselves. It's a memoir, so by definition, it's about our stories. But I think there's lots of universality in what we experience, even though most people will not go to war, and thankfully, most people will never experience what a cult is like. At the end of the day, we're just people who did experience these things, and then somewhat unusually had a twin brother who experienced something different, and then we needed to reconnect, and so to get closer we needed to understand what the other had been through, and the best way for us to do that was through writing and sharing our stories. And so the idea was, if this helps us understand each other better, perhaps it will help our family members or friends, or the family members and friends of people who have been to war or been in a cult, and sort of give voice to their experience, more or less, and be helpful that way. So that's a really long answer to your question, but
that's great.
That hopefully that helps.
No, that's great. I mean, it is very, I mean, it's beautifully written, and I love how you guys alternated chapters. At first, it took a little bit getting used to, because I kept like changing gears, and I would be like left on the edge, like, oh, I wonder what happens, but we're going to talk. But I love it, and how it shows both of you going through that together. And honestly, like, I think it would be a great film. I think like if Angel Films or something picked it up, I think it would be a phenomenal story. Just one, again, because you're twins, and just that comparing that, and I think it's wonderfully written. And
well, they'll save money on the main character, right? Because they only have to hire one actor to play two people.
There you go.
It's basically a discount.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, like, when some people were, I think I emailed you guys, and some people were watching this, they're gonna at first thought I did like some fancy like movie magic, and I'm interviewing the same person twice. But no, it's wonderful, and like it's something that I hope this is not presumptuous, but like one of the things, as I was reading it, I was like, so we have Steve that's climbing his way out of this cult, and then we have Nate who voluntarily signed up for a much larger cult. Going into the Marine Corps.
There are similarities, no doubt about it.
There are a lot of similarities, yeah. But no, sorry. So, Steve, I want to hear you talk about that now.
Yeah, Nate did a great job summarizing. What I'll add to that is writing itself is a cathartic process.
Yeah.
There's a psychologist named Dan Allender, and he's written a book called To Be Told. And it's basically saying, by writing about your life and kind of telling your story, you can exert a measure of control and make sense of what oftentimes has felt beyond comprehension, especially in regard to trauma. So people who kind of bottle things up and hold it in, it's usually never a happy ending. So, writing to make sense of our story is what precipitated the different vignettes that we find in this book. Now, when the cult blew apart in 2010, I started, besides sharing stuff with Nate, so we would share vignettes back and forth, and he would send me stuff, that he had experienced in combat, and I would send him random stuff, often poorly written, in those days, about the cult. But I decided I was going to go ahead and write a book, kind of in the heat of the moment, just as I'm leaving the cult, a months out of the cult, and I'm going to write this book. And boy, it's gonna like just blaze a trail through the ether. People are gonna respond to it. It's gonna be, how many people write books right after they come out of a cult? So I did that. So I wrote like a I don't know, 100-page, 150-page book. I won't even tell you what the title was. It was just, I thought it was helpful and great. And there was a professor, I was in seminary at the time at Dallas Seminary. And there was a well-known professor. His name was Howard Hendricks. We called him Prof. And in those days, he had an eye patch. You know, he'd had some illness with his eye, so he's wearing an eye patch. He's this crusty old guy in his 80s or 90s, very well respected. And I was like, wow, you know, if I can share this book with Prof and get his feedback, you know, I'm sure I'll get some sort of direction of, you know, he'd published a bunch of books and had all these connections, and I thought maybe he could help me. So I emailed it over to him, and his secretary gave me a call, and she set up an appointment that I could meet with him. So I go into his office, and Prof is sitting there. You know, he's kind of hunched over. He's got his eye patch on, and he's like, "I want you to know that I'm on your team." You know, he's like super encouraging, and he's like, "This is a really important, you know, book to get out there. Um, Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna give you the contact information of a real writer." He said, he's he's like, "I'm gonna give you a contact information for a real writer, and you can send the book to him, and he'll work with you to make it something that people will read." And oh, it was perfect. It was just perfect. It was pitch perfect. Because what he did in that moment was he deflated me in a way that I needed to be deflated. He didn't hurt me. He let me know he was on my side, like that I had a story to tell, and maybe I didn't have the experience, you know, or the distance to really, you know, articulate what needed to be said in a way that people would respond to. So he was going to send me to a real author, you know, and I could work with that person. Ironically, I reached out to that person, never heard back, and that's when I started kind of shifting my perspective from this, you know, white hot, like a lot of anger, a lot of intensity in what I was writing, to kind of pulling back a little bit and saying, you know, what would be most important for people to understand about somebody who remained in a cult, like not just a caricature of this religious extremist, but you know, I wanted to be fair to myself and balanced with myself, but also not shy back or you know, or avoid some of the difficult things that needed to be said, so that people could gain understanding that it's not just, you know, people with suicide belts who are in cults, or uh, you know, Jim Jones or David Koresh, you know, the Branch Davidians. There's this whole mythology in our culture of what it means to be in a cult, and I wanted people to understand that it isn't necessarily that it can be less than that. It can be below the radar to some extent, and yet still equally be a cult.
Yeah. Well, you know, that, I mean, it like I said, it's the metaphors and the symbolism you guys use is absolutely amazing. And like how the way you were able to describe things is, I mean, better than many books I've ever read. And here's another thing I'll say is you guys certainly had no issue on the GRE vocab portion. And if there's anyone who is studying for the GRE, this is an excellent book to read because you will be well prepared. Now it wasn't florid. It wasn't like over the top, but there were certain sections where I was like, let me look up that word real quick and make sure I actually understand. But no, it was absolutely wonderful. And there was a note I had here. Can you talk about the difference? Talking about the cult, can you kind of describe that? It may be difficult to describe briefly, but how would you define a cult, and to help someone identify whether or not they are a part of one, or if they know someone is in a cult?
Yeah. And this is a really important distinction, because you don't want somebody listening to say, man, I don't really like my pastor. I bet I'm in a cult, right?
Yeah.
So I've got a little list of attributes of a cult. I'll just read through them, just so we get it
Awesome.
out there for the record. But the first aspect of a cult is there's absolute authoritarianism without accountability. So there's one leader, and they're not accountable to anybody. Second aspect, zero tolerance for criticism or questions. Third aspect, there's unreasonable fears about the outside world that often involve evil conspiracies and persecutions. Number 4, it's painful to leave. So this could be shunning. This could be, hey, if you leave, you're damned. It's hard to leave. Fifth, the 5th point out of 9 points, there's an abuse of members. That could be, it's spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, could be physical abuse, but there's abuse happening. Number 6, there's books or articles documenting abuses of the leader or the group, because generally by the time a group has become a cult, there's this, there's ex-members who are going to the media or, writing articles or blogs themselves about how difficult this group is and how painful it is. Number 7, there's a belief that the leader is the exclusive means of knowing truth. Okay, so there's an exclusivity there. Number 8, there's brainwashing techniques. This could include exhaustion, like we went to church 9 hours on Sunday. And so there's I would come home after Sunday morning services and I would go into this coma sleep for 2 hours. And then we'd go back for another dose of 3 to 4 hours in the evening. You're kept so busy with this group's activities, you don't have time to do anything else. You don't have time to connect with other people. Other brainwashing techniques, gaslighting, guilt, shame, coded talk, curated information. There's control of information, and all of this kind of is our brainwashing techniques. And then the final point, and there's lists. You could find dozens of criteria for a cult, but in my opinion, a cult has both heterodoxy and heteropraxy, as opposed to orthodoxy and orthopraxy, where ortho means straight, right, correct. You think of an orthodontist as trying to make your teeth straight. And hetero means different, other. So heterodoxy is wrong teaching, even if it's subtle, even if it's things are twisted a little bit, because that's all it takes.
Yep.
And heteropraxy means it's unorthodox practice. So you get into this group, and if you're just visiting the group, you're like, these people are, something's off here. There's some weird dynamics here, or some weird practices. One of my seminary profs, Dan Wallace, he said, if you have an original interpretation of Scripture, the heresy bells start ringing. So a lot of these groups, these pastors or cult leaders, they think they have this special anointing to find these hidden meanings, and really, Scripture's, there's lots of levels to Scripture, but if you're coming up with original interpretations of Scripture here in the 20th or 21st century, the heresy bells start to ring. It's, you haven't suddenly gotten this insight about what's really true.
Right.
You're probably going against the church fathers and accepted interpretations.
No, that's good. That list is really good, and I'm going to include that in the show notes. There's some things in there I highlighted, and one of the things that struck me is these sessions that Wes was for the listeners. Wes was the pastor. These sessions he would do, and I have a note here, and after this highlighted portion, I said, Wes bypassed Scripture altogether and delved deeply into our hidden darkness. And I put a note here, the accuser, which oftentimes Satan is classified as the accuser. And I was like, wow, that's that what you said though here is bypassing Scripture altogether. And then the other thing where Wes was the source of salvation, and how he dangled that over the follower's head, and it was no longer about Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The victim affirmation therapy. I wrote a note here. Oh, you guys didn't put that. I put a note, victim affirmation therapy, where I felt pressure to produce vivid memories. I wanted to be healed and to get saved. If terrible things had to happen to me, then I wanted to know about them. And that reminds me a lot of like in our current culture where it's a celebration of victim status, and it gives the victim an element of partial element of power, because it's, I'm a victim, also an element of like, well, I have no responsibility in this, I'm just the victim.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah, it just
introduces passivity into someone's
hmm
life, right? And I think the way Steve framed it was there's a certain level of freedom actually to
hmm
having to ceding control of your life to a strong leader like in a cult. But anyone who's going to take a victim mentality or approach to life is basically saying, I'm not in control, and therefore I'm not
hmm
responsible either for my actions, or usually it's for my outcomes. Right? Other
yeah
people are responsible for that, and
hmm
we've married that also in today's culture with this idea that I deserve good outcomes no matter
hmm
what, right? No matter my effort, um, I deserve good outcomes, and I'm a victim of the people I view as being powerful.
hmm
Um, and then you get all the transfers of wealth, which is just transfer of power. And we don't need to
hmm
get into all that, but I think, you know, people
there's
who,
a lot of parallels.
yeah, there are, right. So again, this comes back to, most people will never be in a cult, nor will most people sort of know anybody who's been in a cult. But
hmm
the dynamics of power and control and manipulation, um, they're all there.
Mhm.
yeah
And when they may be enhanced or magnified in a cult environment or the Marine Corps for certain purposes. To achieve certain outcomes that are in line with the sort of the happy path, right?
hmm
But most people, as they live life, will run into people who are manipulative and controlling and drunk on power
Mhm.
and need control, um, all to the detriment of anyone around them who is unable to sort of escape the gravitational pull of what are oftentimes very
Mhm.
magnetic personalities, right? There's a reason
hmm
that cults continue to proliferate. And it's because there's tons of smart, capable, eloquent, charismatic people out there, men and women, although I think that probably
hmm
trends more towards men getting into abusive levels of control. Um, and so I think everyone can relate to that. Hopefully not at the level that we experienced, but
hmm
everyone sort of knows that that's stuff that you run into in life. And then you have the
yeah
opportunity to respond. How are you going? You get to choose how you respond to that. Is a better way of saying it.
hmm yeah. Well, and I can't remember if you guys put it in here. If I think it was in here, but there is freedom in tyranny, right? It's the freedom to not have to make responsibility. You talked about this, the freedom not to
Mhm.
have to make responsibilities. And something else on that I found really interesting, Nate, was how many times throughout this book you talked about that. You talked about the struggle of being in a position where you were responsible to make those
Mm-hmm.
decisions, and how, like even your earliest
Mhm.
examples of the Virginia Military Institute,
Mm-hmm.
where you went out to town to get the stuff for your men, for your subordinates, and then you like got some chow on your way back, and
Mm-hmm.
you're getting in trouble for that. And he punished you, but he didn't take away your rank. And you're like, I want basically like I'd rather you take this away.
Yeah.
And so, can you
Mhm.
talk about that a little bit? And coming again, there's the reason I love this book too is because it showed that side of you that was foreign to me during our time together at Bangor, Washington. So can you talk about that some? If you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to use deadly force to defend yourself or to defend someone else, then you're going to want a good legal team defending you after the fact. And that's why I trust Attorneys on Retainer. And if you want to see how AOR compares to those other CCW insurance providers, then scan this QR code or check out my affiliate link in the description. They have individual and family plans so that you will be legally protected should you ever need to protect your life or someone else's life. And don't forget to use promo code DAD to save $25 on your initial sign up.
Yeah, so it's been interesting as this book has now gone out to live in the world and has made its way into environments where people who thought they knew me, and in many ways they did, right? It's not like I was being false as I was a Marine officer, and then as I've subsequently had leadership roles in the civilian sector, but they didn't see all of me, and none of us sees all of us.
Right.
And so there's some trepidation around divulging some of these personal, usually private episodes of doubt. And I have been told by a number of people I respect a lot, people who knew me in the war, that I'm too harsh on myself. And that's possibly true. I did grow up in a cult, right? I didn't stay as long as Steve did, but certainly from a very young age until I was 17, that was my environment. And so a highly critical, self-doubting, let someone else make the decision. It's going to be wrong if you do it. Like, that's how I was raised. And I think that's something I'm always going to have to fight against. And I do, right? I mean, I've put myself into environments where I've been forced, or if not forced, at least afforded the opportunity to make decisions. And usually I do, and I have. And on the net, I think I've done a great job. But there are these private moments of doubt that you just wouldn't publicize normally, but we have, and I have. And so that's being vulnerable. Steve and I talked about it as we were working on this book, and there's always this temptation, I think. It's like extremes. There's the tendency to either overshare, which people do all the time in social media and our culture. Like, there's this oversharing where you do the sucking teeth noise when you read something. You're like, oh, okay, we're going there, right? Like,
yeah,
interesting. Okay, you buckle up and then you do it, and this becomes a sign of authenticity, right? And someone's personal brand, and people often respond really well to that until you take it too far. But on the other side, and I would say most of the war literature that's out there is about heroes or heroic circumstances, or about, frankly, for lack of a better term, sort of testosterone-fueled special operators. And yes, they have their struggles, but at the end of the day, we're talking about a Delta operator or a SEAL team operator or special forces, and it's like, okay, well, there's some vulnerability there, but you were a SEAL, right? Like, you're not really that relatable, truly. And that's what's on all these Iraq War book lists. It's all these books which are sold in their thousands, tens of thousands, millions sometimes, and none of that's necessarily wrong or bad, but it's not complete in terms of the experience of having gone to war. And in my experience, and I don't know how universal my experience is or has been, but I know enough people have responded to say, well, that's what I felt like, right? And I never knew, right? So there's this sense of like, okay, well, I guess it's okay to have doubt sometimes. I guess it's okay to fail sometimes, and to acknowledge that, and not have that make you a failure, right? Which I don't feel like a failure, even though I've failed a number of times. I've also put myself in positions to fail, right? I've pushed myself. I've made choices to do hard things. And so I guess it's a really long way to just say, there's lots in there that people who know me but didn't know that part of it. Someone I talked to yesterday said there were a couple times where I just sat up straighter when I got to a section. It's like, oh, okay, so all right, I didn't know that about you, and we're going to work through this. So, and sort of the same reaction that you might have on social media when people overshare. But I think a book without that talks about all these great decisions I made, or what my reputation was as an officer, that doesn't also go into the challenges, is just inauthentic. And you can buy 100,000 books out there that are relatively inauthentic and have the same message, the same flavor. This was intended to be different, because we want it to help people and to reach people where they are, but at the same time not diminish the real accomplishments that I think both Steve and I have been able to enjoy.
Oh, I like that. It reminds me of this section. I think this is Steve talking about Gray, and there was a cool cleanness about everything, and this is when he was talking about war. There's a cool cleanness about everything, a neat texture, a distance that made combat seem brave, bloodless, and mythical. World War II, Nate and I gathered, had been the time of Gray's life. And then a couple sections down, you say, I never stopped to consider why Gray filled garbage bags full of beer cans, or why he started drinking each day before lunch. And that it's so true, because that's the other part, right? Not always the other part, but it's not sterilized of that human element like some of these books are. And that's what I love about this book, is it shows that. But it does it in a way that's not, some people do that, like the humble brag. There's a lot of humble brags that people do, where it's like, okay, like that's like the job interview question where it's like, oh, my biggest weakness is that I just try too hard and I'm a perfectionist. It's like, okay, whatever.
That's such a garbage answer.
Absolutely. And so my wife, she's an HR director, so like she tells me about these interviews and like these resumes she gets sometime, and I'm like, you have to be kidding me! This is what people say and do during interviews. But no, it's so. So yeah, you guys did you perfectly balanced that and the human element, and I think it all just boils down to honesty, right? Like I think there's a thirst for honesty in our culture. Everything is so fake. Everything is so polished. Everything is just has such an Instagram filter on it that to see authentic honesty, people really appreciate it. And I have a video. It's called 6 Lies About the AR-15, and I talk like 3 lies from one side of the argument, 3 lies from the other. And that's actually the most successful video. But I think it's because I call out both sides, and obviously I still have my opinions, and I have there are things, my belief systems. Then I have another one where it's a corrections video to that video where I call out myself and address mistakes that I make. And like that, people love that one as well. But it's difficult to get to that point because, we're so used to, I felt like sometimes it's difficult to get to that point because we're so used to everyone not putting on their true face and putting on the media face or whatever face they feel that is acceptable or is not going to get them canceled. And it's really refreshing to see that. And on that note, is there anything in the book that was particularly difficult to write from an emotional standpoint, or possibly something that maybe the publisher asked you to boulderize and remove because they were afraid that, oh, we can't publish this?
Before we answer that, can I just, because I think it's relevant to your last comment about, the most popular session that you've hosted is sort of balances truth from both sides, and people seem to respond to that. Steve, do you want to talk about, and we don't have to be attributional about it, but I would say our favorite review to date of the book?
Yeah. You talking about Emily's review? Yeah. So we got a review recently by somebody who was very honest that this is a book she would not ever normally pick up, let alone read. She considers herself kind of on the other side of the culture wars and would never read about a Marine, would never read about Christian extremists. It's just not a place that she would want to go. But she said she read the book because she respects the publisher. She happens to know the publisher. And she said she couldn't put it down. She found it riveting, and she said it connected with her humanity.
Mm.
As a human being, she was resonating with what we were talking about, regardless of where we fall in the
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote culture wars.
Yeah.
And even though, as she said, these authors aren't perfect, they're still working through their stuff, which is
She was probably
true.
referring to you. I would imagine. I'll get it all sorted.
um, her review itself was an honest review.
Yeah.
But the fact that she read the whole thing through, and she now has an understanding of what combat's like, not just what the movies say it is, but what it
Mm-hmm.
is actually like. And um, she has an understanding of what it's like to grow up in an extreme religious environment, instead of just kind of like stepping away from that and
Mm-hmm.
saying, I'm not even going to go there. She engaged with it, and her humanity was wrung.
Mm.
The reverberations are in her soul. That's an amazing review from somebody who would not normally ever pick up
Yeah.
a war memoir or a cult memoir.
That's awesome. Yeah, I get some comments like that from people who typically would not watch a video like that, and those are
Yeah.
some of the best comments I get. And
Mm,
we have fruitful
mm,
conversations in the comment
mhm.
section, which I didn't think actually happened in comment sections, but it's
Right.
it's fantastic. So, um, real quick, I want to jump back
Yeah.
into the what did I ask? I can't remember what I asked a second ago.
I think it was you'd asked about if there's any elements that were particularly emotional or difficult for us to
Yeah, yeah,
write
yeah.
about.
Was there anything particularly like difficult to write about from an emotional standpoint, or that maybe the publisher asked you to like boulderize or kind of remove or whatever because they were maybe, I don't know, for I know that publishers sometimes maybe have different motives from the writer,
Mhm.
and they kind of have to like balance those two things.
Yeah. Well, I would say first we've got a great publisher, an independent publisher. We never did get picked up by an agent or a mainstream publishing house, and I think that's to the benefit of the final
Mm,
product. We
Mhm.
found someone in Dr. Peter Schultz and Theron Press who resonated with the story, were aligned with how we presented it, and made it better through their editing process. So,
Mhm.
highly recommend Theron Press, Peter Schultz, Katie Rudder, the copy editor. I mean, really, in our view, phenomenal job and made it a much better product. But um, I would say there are some things. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Peter, after reading through the book as we presented it to him, thought that we copped out sometimes and had glossed over key things that he thought any outside reader who is unfamiliar with our story would want to know. And so
mm,
there are sections that I think Steve added in related to what some of the abuse actually was, and references to how bad it actually got, and not all of it's in there, right? Some of that detail is omitted, appropriately so and necessarily so,
yeah.
but at least paints a, a clearer picture about why this was so bad. This is not just a church that was strict,
Hmm.
right? It went
Yeah.
way beyond that. So I thought that was important, and I imagine difficult, Steve, for you to sort of grapple with.
Yeah. Um, it actually, ironically, um, there was some of the detail, because I mean, it's just the tip of the iceberg. I just wanted to give, um, you know, a sense of what the abuse was, but I could have gone on and on and on. I mean, I could have written
Hmm.
1,000 pages about
Hmm.
specific gratuitous abuses, but that, I mean, to what point?
Hmm.
That would have defeated the purpose of the book. It would have become a memoir, right? Like this dark book, that becomes a cathartic thing for myself, but doesn't help a reader. Um, it was never fun to write about ways that I was culpable
Mm.
or overly credulous, because obviously in hindsight we know what was going on, and people like Nate understood at the time what was going on.
Yeah.
and I didn't see it. So to write a book knowing it's going to go out into the world where you yourself are a unreliable narrator in the sense of, I mean, I hopefully the vulnerability makes me a reliable narrator, but in terms of how I perceive things at the time, yeah, I was wrong. So how do you convey that in a way that's accurate, but is also not like flagellating me constantly? Like, to what point would that be? While not glossing over it. So finding that balance, Nate was able to help as he edited my sections. And there was a lot that got cut. I mean, the book, if it started like this, a lot of it is just editing down to where your things are taught and the story moves along and every word either advances character or plot. It's like Michelangelo, he saw the block of stone and he took away everything that wasn't the sculpture, right? It's the same in a book. You try and take all the boring parts out. Our editor says the slugs, remove the slugs, kill your darlings, get rid of stuff that doesn't advance the plot or the character development. Another chapter that was hard was a chapter towards the end where it was almost like Pastor West had this momentary pang of conscience, and to include a chapter where he himself was vulnerable or attempting to be, that was a hard chapter to write. I would have preferred to have nothing but criticism about the man, but it wouldn't have been accurate because there was that moment where things seemed like they might turn a better direction. And so most of his words in the book, anything that's from the pulpit that's in the book is verbatim.
Wow.
It's absolutely verbatim because I listened to old church tapes from those messages, so I would record it verbatim. So it's not my guesswork, it's actually what he said. And I was trying to be fair, I was trying to be balanced, but at the end of the day, the man had a personality disorder. He was a narcissist. He had OCD, personality disorder. And unfortunately, personality disorders there's a very, very, very small percent of people who ever recover from them, I'm told. And I don't know of any cult leaders who have ever, repented. In fact, after the church fell apart and I reached out to some cult specialists and I asked them, I said, have you ever heard of a cult leader who afterwards said they were wrong, that they were sorry, that they repented? And the director of one of these places said, I never have. And, in 40 years of ministry, working with, former cult members and churches that are cults, groups that are cults, he's like, I've never heard of a cult leader that repented. So, I'm not sure all that was going on with Pastor West, but he never did repent.
Wow.
He believed it to the bitter end.
Yeah, man, there's a lot of good stuff there. Yeah, I put down some notes. The first thing I want to say is how, and I noticed this in the writing, and I, at least I could kind of see it, and it almost jumped off the pages. I think so many people think that they would not be, that they would be incredulous, to something like this. And you did a great job of showing that, like, no, like no one is immune to it. Well, I would say no one is immune to it, given the right context, given the right state of life, whatever, and the right delivery of it. So
right.
just being aware that of your own shadow and how you could fall into that is just so important. And I think oftentimes it's also important to know that to help as almost an antidote from that happening to you. And the other thing you talked about was editing, and I can completely relate to editing because some of my earlier videos are horrible because it's just long, drawn out me talking for way too long. It's like a 20-minute video when it could have been a 5-minute video. And I can't remember who it was. A buddy of mine, he said, he said you should be more brutal in your editing process, and and it's so true. So now whenever I edit, I think the estimate now is I leave like 10% or less of whatever I record. So if I record 60 minutes of footage, it's only going to be a 6-minute video, if that.
Mhm.
And ever since I started doing that, though, I mean, it's just and what you said about the statue too. You're just carving away until all you're left with is that perfect sculpture.
Yeah.
I'm working my way to perfect, but we're not there yet. But the other thing you talked about is the humanity of Wes, and even though he was the cult leader, I think it's awesome that you're able to again toe that line of honesty where you're giving credit where credit's due and criticism where criticism is due, and showing that humanity. Because I've often noticed in our culture we tend to think in terms of absolutes when it's good or bad. It's either good guys or bad guys, and it's almost like a Disney way of thinking because there's no backstory of why that person was bad. There's no going back to the first part here where you could be the bad guy at some point, understanding your own complicit if you are complicit with allowing evil to fester. And so I'm really glad that you show that humanity to show that, like, yeah, it's not just the bad mystery guy that everyone hates. It's he's also a human, and he has his own failures and faults and everything like that. So that's really good. Going back to what makes a cult, can you guys speak to differentiating a cult from a church that is based in like biblical principles? Because I think a lot of people, especially people who are would like to criticize Christianity, as a whole, would just say, "Well, you all are part of a cult because you're following someone who told people that I'm the only way." And so, can you speak to that?
I feel like my pocket theologian needs to answer that one. That's what I always used to call Steve when we reconnected, and I never lost faith. But there are times where I was probably pretty distant from God and fairly angry, and I'd leave a church service or I'd be reading a book usually, and I'd like angry text him like, "What about this? And what does this mean? And what's it say in Hebrew and Greek?" And he'd like respond, thoughtfully, and I started calling him my pocket theologian. But I mean, I would maybe I can answer that first. Is that, and this is going to be, a point of departure for most people. But when it's the Son of God telling you that they're the only truth, then they're right. So that's a key differentiator, and there's only one, right? So every subsequent person. Let's talk about in terms of the Christian faith, is a follower, and nobody has been given sort of divine leadership responsibility. I mean, this can be very divisive, and there are different elements of Christianity. I won't name them, but everyone has, there are strong opinions and dogma associated with church leadership and who's right and who's wrong and so on and so forth. There's lots of room for appropriate debate there without casting people into hell, right? And saying like, you're unsaved. So
there are fundamental tenets, right?
Correct.
And then other things we can quibble about.
That's right. So I think that's probably the most important element is when you've got a strong, charismatic leader. And by the way, most people are programmed to seek belonging in a tribe. I mentioned this the other day, but Sebastian Junger wrote the book Tribe. Sebastian Junger, war correspondent in the field with grunts in Afghanistan, among other places. And I mean, so he's been there. He's been downrange. He's heard the bullets snap over. Like, this guy's been in combat, but he's also been a civilian, closely observing the infantry as they fight and as they go to war. So he's developed an enormous respect. It's sort of the Ernie Pyle level of respect for these grunts. But he's also supremely well educated and has enormous perspective from travels around the world. And his observations as he's sort of got back away from combat, and he's seen in particular combat veterans try to go out and navigate culture, is that, boy, a lot of veterans play the victim card. right? And they feel sorry for themselves, and they expect culture, and particularly America, to give them something. And he points out that there are lots of other professions and careers that have a higher casualty rate than even the infantry, like linemen and other jobs, coal miners, right? And like nobody feels bad for them. So he's like, so stop going out if you're a veteran and asking for sympathy when you volunteered for it, right? But it all circles back to the sense of his point was veterans often struggle leaving the military because they lose this sense of connection to something greater and more important than themselves, which most of us want that. And when we don't find it post-military, we seek it out somewhere else, whether it's a sports team. I live in SEC country, so you got people identifying with UGA or Alabama or whatever, and they're very vociferous about it, and exactly where they stand. And they're completely unapologetic about it, and these are their people, right? I used to think it was not serious, because I grew up in New England, where things like this are not serious. We take other things to extremes. But boy, people are serious, and they will cut off relationships, and they will not go to weddings if you've had the misfortune to schedule it on a game day. That's like, to me, dumb things like that. But it all circles back to, well, these are my people, and this is how I get meaning. And you can extrapolate that so many different ways in culture. And one of those ways is religion and who you're following. And so there are people out there that take advantage of it, and they probably, as Steve's point, no cult leaders ever repented. Like, they genuinely believe what they're saying, but they've kicked themselves free of any accountability. In our case with our cult, one of the key steps along the path to becoming a cult was voting to remove ourselves from, I don't know, like the New England Baptist Association.
The Conservative Baptist Association, CBA.
Right, which is a redundancy, right? Because I don't know any Baptist that's not conservative. It's like, anyways. But that was a very visible, obvious involvement of the entire congregation, where we all were more or less forced to say, nope, we're better than them. They can't control us. We are no longer bound by a constitution. Our constitution is the Bible, and our leader is God. But really, it meant God's anointed leader, Wes, right? And that use of the term anointed is very much a Old Testament reference, intentionally so, right, to this really outdated economy of faith that is not applicable.
It's messianic.
It's messianic.
It's messianic.
100%. So, I'm sorry, again, a really long response. I've digressed somewhat, but
this is great.
How does someone not associate all Christians with cults? And the answer is that most churches are structurally, they're parts of larger associations where there's some level of accountability externally for the church itself, so it doesn't deviate into heterodoxy, as Steve said, or whatever the other word was that you used.
Heteropraxy.
Yeah, heteropraxy. So that's the external sort of accountability. And then you've got the internal accountability of things like deacons and deaconesses, or different boards and committees, or the congregation itself. And in healthy churches, all of those in some way could remove a toxic leader, right? There's ways to do, hey, you no longer have a job, right? But if you can't have that conversation, or there's nothing baked in to your church to do any of those things, you need to be careful, because you're now putting your faith and all control into a single human. And as we've seen countless times in world history, or most of us have seen in our own lives, when you give someone all the power with no accountability, it's funny. I've got a quote behind me. I think it's from Abraham Lincoln. And it says, "Every man withstands adversity. To reveal his true character, give a man power."
Mm.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that was
Mhm.
actually made by one of my buddies I served with in the war, from New Orleans, who was doing woodwork. But I love the quote because it's universal,
Yeah.
right? We've all
Mhm.
seen that when someone has power, and few people are able to handle absolute power well. It's just not who we
Yeah.
are.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
So
I mean, that's why the U.S. government was set up the way it was to help,
totally.
to be a buttress against that. Yeah.
Mhm. And if we let me interject a few thoughts as well. I think I agree 100% with what Nate said. But if you go back to the first century, um, you know, Jesus didn't have one disciple, he had 12 disciples, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they had different personalities. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, he said Peter would be the foundation of the church, but what happened to Peter on the night Jesus was betrayed? He failed 3 times, 3 obvious times,
Mm-hmm.
and that got put in scripture. And in part, that was to keep Peter humble. He had a strong personality. He was the type of guy that could have, run roughshod over others. Jesus wanted his strength as a leader, but he also wanted him to never forget that he could fall and fail,
Yeah.
and had done so. I think I think we shouldn't judge a system by its abuse. So you don't want to take a caricature of a system, namely a cult, and say, "Hey, everybody in Christianity is part of a cult." It's not. It's just the definitions don't work.
Mm-hmm.
But what we see in the New Testament, we don't see a sharp ecclesiology study of the church, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we
Right.
don't see um, this is how a church is supposed to look in terms of the length of your service, or how many leaders you're supposed to have. Although we
Mm-hmm.
see usually a plurality of leaders, there's multiple leaders in New Testament churches, and they're accountable to each other. But uh, we don't see a sharp ecclesiology because there's room for culture, there's room for differences of personalities. I mean, there's room for all these denominations that we have. It doesn't mean you're wrong. um I lost my train of thought.
Well,
um
it's not
but
prescriptive, is it? It just
right.
goes back to there's certain fundamentals, and beyond that,
Yeah.
there's room for diversity, and not in sort of the popular, like DEI sort of movements that we're seeing, but true diversity. If you go to West Africa and go to a church there, to Kenya, you're going to see a markedly different church service than you would if you go to a New England Baptist church, or a
Mhm.
Southern Baptist church for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And a person from one church experiencing a service for the first time, the other might feel uncomfortable. It might not speak to them, and I mean, generally that's okay, right?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much opportunity for diversity, but um, it's when you become prescriptive, and also when you start carving out, battle lines and doing the us versus them. Um,
Mhm.
Christianity in many ways, are arguably is like the most inclusive, or should be the most inclusive religion, not from the standpoint of like, um, you know, everyone's saved, everyone's going to heaven or whatever, but just
Mm-hmm.
in terms of Jesus came to,
Yep.
to the sick, to the poor, to the
Yep.
weak, to all the people who are less than and other than in that culture. And that's a beautiful thing. And anytime the church today deviates from that, you really got to question.
And what you see in cults is a top down, where the leader is coming down on top of the people
Mhm.
to
Mm-hmm.
to push them down, make them less than, guilt, shame, when the model of Jesus and Christianity is a leader comes underneath to push people
Mm-hmm.
up.
Mhm.
And that's not
Yep.
what you see in cults. In cults, the
Yeah.
leaders are abusive, they're milking people of money and time, and they'll run you into the grave happily, for
Yeah.
their on their mission. And in reality, a healthy church has leaders who are coming underneath the people to raise them up and raise their gifts up
Mhm.
and serve them. It's servant leadership. And,
Yeah.
Jesus himself is the ultimate model of that.
And I
That's
think,
so true. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Taylor, but I was going to say, and I think your experience in the Marine Corps, or I reference in the book my experience at VMI and the Marine Corps, I write less about the great leaders I served under, although they hold an important place in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I talk about the ones who probably were more challenged, right? Or tended to be
Mm-hmm.
more manipulative or not good. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but when you think about, or when I think about the leaders I'm most respected in the Marines, it's exactly what Steve just said. It's those who came and used their strength and their proficiency to teach, to encourage, to build up. It was that servant
Yeah.
leadership that I think, or in business, it's the same thing. I mean, this is a universal trait that I've seen people respond to favorably is we all want to follow someone when it doesn't feel like following, right? When it just
Yeah.
feels like they're making you better and everything around you
Mm-hmm.
better. And that's a healthy leadership,
Mm-hmm.
I view. And it's modeled
No,
in
absolutely.
Christ in many ways.
Very much the case. And you guys said it absolutely incredibly. And there are many reasons why I believe that Jesus was the Son of God, but one of the big ones is the fact that Christianity is completely unique from all of the religions, right? Every other religion is you earning your salvation. You got skin in the game. You have to do this, do this, do this, do this, and do this checklist in order to get to heaven and or earn that. And that is that's rooted in the human ego to think that you can prove yourself before a perfect God to be able to earn that. Whereas Christianity, like you said, God came down and sacrificed himself for us. And I use math. This is kind of nerdy, but I kind of compare it with like math. If you have infinity, anything divided by infinity is zero, right? So a billion divided by infinity is zero. So if you think about the top, the numerator being our works divided by God, which is going to be what our works are going to compare to, all of it's going to be zero, except for one thing, which is infinity, which that's undefined. Not to get too nerdy, but but yeah. So it's like it just makes sense. And anytime you see a cult or any perversion of that, there's always an element of the human ego and always an element of either you can do this yourself and earn this, or you need something else other than Christ. And so I think that's also, at least for me, a good way to determine that. And also just the exclusivity of Christianity, and what for me helps to confirm that, like, that it's so counterintuitive to the human ego to have the way Christianity is actually set up. And so it's very beautiful. But
it's well said.
Yeah. So real quick, I was funny. I was on the phone with Stephen Ulrich the other day, and while we were on the phone, this is crazy. While we were on the phone, he got a Facebook memory that popped up, and this is that memory. I don't know if you can.
There it is. Yep, out in the limited area.
Yeah. That was yesterday too. The day before this call, he got that memory that popped up on his phone. Yeah, and I remember, was that right before you left? Was that picture that we took?
Close to it, if I recall. I mean, I was only with RTT for, call it, a year, and just enough time to make you guys lose your black hoodie sweatshirts and all within Marine Corps grooming standards.
Yeah. Well, I always tell people it was almost like we were a pack of undomesticated dogs, and you were like the perfect captain that we needed, right? And when I say undomesticated, I don't mean wild dogs, right? I mean like canine unit dogs. It's like, this is not a dog you would let around your children. This is a dog you have to run. You have to give it space, and you definitely gave us space to run, especially with that 11-mile run we went on.
You guys were awesome. It was such a joy to. It's actually probably my hardest leadership experience in the Marines was with RTT, because I spent the majority of that year wondering if I always felt like I was going to get punked out, because I like sit down with you guys and then someone would ask a question. I'm like, gosh, I don't know the answer to that, or I'm not sure I know the answer to that. Like, they're just asking hard questions because they want to see if I know the answer. And I think ultimately it was just that you guys thought I knew everything. And so it's like, oh, I'll just ask this question. But it's such a good group of physically fit, motivated guys doing really hard work. And ultimately, it's one of my greatest memories is working with you guys.
Well, it was awesome. And I don't know if you remember this, because I'd assume you said it several times for it to stick. But you remember the phrase that you would say, train to a higher standard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you know that is my like sign off for all my videos?
No, that's cool.
Yeah. So every single video, including this one, I always say, as always, train to a higher standard.
Good.
And that's it.
That's great.
When I first started, I was like, because everyone has like a sign off for this, the whole YouTube space. And I was like, that'd be a good one. And it just stuck. And so, yeah, I got it on a shirt. I got it. Yeah, it's definitely been
it's hard to go. It's hard to go wrong with that, right? I mean, I think, especially in the nature of your business, when you're dealing with conceivably life and death, and that's certainly the business that we were all in the infantry and security forces. It's hard to overtrain as long as you're training properly. You'll never regret that when you go down range or when that event happens and it's split second. If the training's not there, if the muscle memory is not there, there's no time to gain that at that point. So, I think at that point, few of you guys had actually been down range, although all of you mostly would go. But I sort of viewed it as, I know where you're going. Although I hadn't been in Afghanistan, but I figured combat probably mirrors combat for the most part.
Well, and even in law enforcement, like we had standards, and I'm going to use air quotes for that, standards. And so those standards, and that's obviously what they called them. And that's another reason I like it, because there's a standard, but let's train to a higher standard, right? Let's go above that. Let's go beyond 75% accuracy on the handgun qual. Let's go to, how about 100%?
Right.
And let's go beyond the fact that you get basically physical fitness tenure the moment you're hired, and then you don't get a PT test for the next 20 years. Let's do that every 6 months or something, even if it's your own. And so so no, and like I said, you were just the perfect person to fill that role. And man, anyone that had to follow that just had some serious shoes to fill.
Oh, I'm sure they did great, but you're kind to say that.
But no, this has been phenomenal. But before we go, I have one more thing, and let's go.
Look at these guys. Oh, I love it. You've been one before, and now you're inviting the whole squad. Hey, guys. Look at those awesome vet beards.
What's going on?
I love it. Chris, Corey, Ryan.
I mean, I
love it. It's good to see you.
What's going on? Yeah, you too.
Absolutely. How are you doing?
Carl's doing the FBI informant look.
Yeah. He's got to put on his black bar sunglasses before he gets on.
So, Steve, I have to ask. Hopefully, you haven't blown yourself up recently.
No, I tend to stay away from that now. I'm a little. This is like where I live right now. This is flying a desk, chilling out.
Schreiner, were you pre or post Steve going to breaching school?
I had the misfortune of actually spinning him up for breacher
Did
school,
you?
So I take ownership of part of that one too.
So Steve, my brother, breaching is an important part of infantry, Marine Corps, but in security forces, make entry in places where they don't want you to. And so there's a whole course for that, as you can imagine. And you have to be really smart, physically fit. Even with all that, we still sent Steve to breacher's course. I'm kidding. But I think he had a run in with some C4 or something.
Yeah. It was some C4, a big charge, and sent a big chunk of it through my butt. Took out a big part of my butt cheek. The Chad's actually West. He actually met the guy. I think he met him, or at least he knew him. But he met the guy at EOD that was the one who blew himself up. That I was the recipient of the shrapnel of. But
anyways, I jest because all these guys were top notch, and it's awesome to see you guys.
It's been a minute.
Good to see you
That's
guys.
awesome. Super happy about the success of their book and everything. And
Absolutely.
I just got my copy in yesterday. I have not finished it. I read the first page,
Awesome.
and it was a struggle.
He had on the first
But I'm
page. He
making
had to
it.
use the dictionary 4 times.
Yeah, my 4-year-old is helping me with all the words.
The graphic novel's coming out next month.
That's
Coloring
what
book.
I was gonna say. I either need to.
The coloring book.
I was just with these guys that I was gonna record myself reading it and submit it to you as the audio book version, so that other folks like me can have the.
Steve had mentioned, he was hoping at some point it might make the Commandant's reading list, and I was like, well, I mean, it needs to be a coloring book and have crayons, and then we can maybe get it on there.
At least a part of it, like a pull out or something. Or
No. So where are you guys at? Steve, where are you?
I'm in Sacramento. I recently moved from the Bay Area. I'm up in
How you like
Sacramento, California.
It's a nice area, isn't it?
I love it. Yeah. We just moved up here we were in Concord, and then we just moved up here a little closer to where I grew up.
What about you, DeCoop?
Up in Ohio, of all places. I met my wife, and she said she's from Ohio, and I couldn't even point it out on a map. Now I live here, so
Whereabouts in Ohio?
I like Toledo area.
I lived in Columbus for a while.
Oh yeah, I saw that in the book. That was. How did you like it down there?
It was fine. It never felt like home for me, but only Maine has felt like home, so it was nice.
Cool.
What about you, Corey?
Oh, I live in the same place I grew up in, really, and so kind of in between here and West Texas all the time.
Do you ever hang out with the Cowboys?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Oh, I was just saying the guys that used to visit us at Bangor and drop off presents.
Oh yeah,
Cowboys.
Well, where'd Shin go? Because he worked for them for a little bit.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, I was like,
Yeah, he was part of it for a while.
Goodness, I've seen some of their training videos, and those are impressive guys. Chris, where are you?
I'm in Central Illinois, so Bloomington, Normal area.
How long have you been there?
Shortly after getting out of the Marine Corps in 2011, so we've been here in town for right about 10 years.
So you guys have all congregated in the Midwest and the West. And then Taylor, you're down in Tennessee, right?
Yep.
I'll let you know next time I'm out there.
Please do.
And for the rest of you guys, if you're ever down in Georgia, let me know. Taylor has my
We'll take you
email.
up on that.
I was there a few years ago for something, but I was in like Savannah. Who's the big? Is it Boeing or there's like a big jet company?
Lockheed Martin has a big presence around here. Yeah.
What part again of Georgia?
So I'm in the Atlanta area,
Oh yeah, okay.
but yeah, Taylor has my email, and
I'm
I'll
not
make sure he
sharing
has
it
my
with
phone
anyone.
number.
I'm not sharing it with
I was
anyone.
going to say, he's going to hold that one to the vest.
You guys missed it. He said I was his favorite. So take that how you want it.
I was going to say that. I thought you guys were all going to be together in the same room, so I was going to say it and like drop it like a hand grenade, and then just walk away.
Walk away.
That would have been really cool to just like all just show up. No.
Well, this has been great. Steve, Nate, again, thank you guys so much for coming on. Thank you so much for the book and for, just the vulnerability and the honesty that you have in that. And for anyone watching, I would really encourage you to check out this book. Guys, thank y'all for coming on. And thank you so much for watching. And as always, Nate, you want to take it?
Train to a higher standard.
You heard it.
Hey, brother.
Hi, Nate. How you doing?
Hey, sir. Good to see you. We Raw Simplify.
You have to come on like that.
It's me, Steve. Don't you recognize me?